Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Susanna Pyatt. I'm the Collections and Archives Manager here at the Folk School, and today I'm presenting on the early cooperative history of the Folk School. So I started working here about a year and a half ago, and pretty early on I heard mention of the cooperative creamery and credit union that the school had helped to found in Brasstown. This got my interest, so I was pretty excited to be able to research more about these for this presentation. I originally didn't expect to find very much, mainly because, almost 100 years later, details about the co-ops don't seem to be part of the memories of most of the people who I've met here, though maybe I haven't asked the right people about it yet. There's some collections of papers related to the cooperatives in the Folk School's archives, but they're pretty small collections. So as I started researching more, I was really surprised just by how much information is in other collections in the archives about the co-ops, and also by how integral the co-ops were in the first decades of the Folk School. So to research this presentation, I looked through books and documents in the archives, like correspondence, school newsletters, sets of meeting minutes, oral history interviews, and photographs. I did some secondary source reading too, and so tonight I'll outline the context and chronology of the Folk School's co-ops as I currently understand them. But I'm hoping to do more research, especially in Olive Day and Campbell's papers, which are at UNC Chapel Hill's collections, and in other history sources that help provide more understanding for all of the influences that were impacting the founders of the Folk School. And if y'all know some more details about the cooperatives as I go along, please chime in. So while there were many influences on Olive Day and Campbell and Marguerite Butler's design for the Folk School, the most important one was that of the Danish model of folk high schools. Olive and her late husband, John C. Campbell, had long looked to Danish folk schools as a possible solution for issues in the mountains. During the Campbells' work in southern Appalachia, their primary concern became how to keep the rural population happily in place, living fulfilling lives in the region without feeling a need to migrate to urban areas. The Campbells wanted to travel to Denmark to study folk schools in person, but their trip was delayed by World War I and then by John's death in 1919. In 1922, Olive was finally able to set forth on a study trip to Scandinavia, accompanied by Marguerite Butler, who had been working at Pine Mountain Settlement School in eastern Kentucky. And in her study of Danish folk schools, Olive asked what was the central question at the heart of their study: how shall we keep an enlightened, progressive, and contented farming population on the land? So in Denmark, folk high schools were created in the late 19th century, based on the educational philosophies of N.F.S. Grundtvig. By the 1920s, there were dozens of these schools in Scandinavia. Authors like Georgist reformer Frederick C. Howe credited the non-competitive, rurally located folk schools as a key feature of what these authors identified as the ideal democratic society that had been created in Denmark. According to Howe's 1936 book on Danish co-ops, Denmark was ruled democratically by the working class. Folk high schools and similar opportunities for adult education went hand in hand with co-ops in creating an environment in which this kind of working class democracy was possible. The educational system created a well-informed, politically engaged population. Widespread involvement in the operation of co-ops helped maintain that kind of civic engagement. As people's economic power increased through cooperative activity, so did their political power. And then as small-scale Danish farmers gained more political and economic control, including ownership of land, the country's standard of living increased. By the time of Howe's studies in the 1920s and 30s, he held up the Danish peasant as, quote, the most contented farmer in the world, due to his economic security, comfortable lifestyle, and political and economic power. So the current historical narrative of the folk school tends to focus on mostly the educational and the classes aspect of the folk school model. But Olive and Marguerite saw more than that on their travels. They examined a full socioeconomic system in Scandinavia that had non-competitive adult education as a central feature and also included elements such as folk heritage museums like the Log Cabin Museum, and of course cooperatives. When they returned to the United States, they brought back all of these elements with them to found their own folk school. And I really like this detail from a photo from the folk school's early years. It was a display at a county fair. And in the display, all the different programs and goals and partnerships of the school are represented like spokes on a wheel coming out from Keith House. And I think it's a really good illustration of how many ways the folk school branched out. It's still like all these different aspects of it are related committed to its core goals. So in addition to Danish schools and co-ops, the folk school founders were in contact with a variety of other people and movements with similar interests in other regions of North America. And I won't go into all of these today, but there's indications that Olive and Marguerite were familiar with agricultural reform efforts like Horace Plunkett, who had his own foundation in Ireland, and also the country life movement in the United States. They knew about the Antigonish movement, which was focused on adult education and cooperatives in Nova Scotia. Marguerite and Olive were friends with Art and Mary Weiser of the Macedonia cooperative community in North Georgia. And in turn, the folk school served as an example of bringing the Danish system to the US and occasionally received visitors or carried out correspondence with people who were interested in starting folk schools elsewhere, similar reform efforts elsewhere. And so one of the points that I want to make is that cooperatives were really an integral part of the early structure of the folk school. One description of the folk school from 1930 begins, quote, cooperative associations and clubs, educational and social meetings, demonstration farm, and a 4-month course which offers little in books, no examinations, and no credits. These at first glance may not seem a school, but such is the John C. Campbell Folk School. The school's newsletters of the 1920s and 30s regularly report on the development and successes of the co-op, so there's a lot of space dedicated to these. The extra long 5th anniversary newsletter is mostly about the cooperatives, with the inclusion of many quotes from Irish reformers and cooperative supporters Horace Plunkett, again, and his successor George William Russell. And then finally, one of the first trustees of the folk school, Chris L. Christensen, was actually the head of the USDA Bureau of Cooperative Marketing and had written a publication specifically about co-ops in Denmark. The folk school's founders and original staff began organizing local cooperatives pretty much from the outset of the school. So to go over the list pretty quickly, the first was the Brasstown Credit Union, officially organized in May of 1926. Community men's and women's clubs were also founded in 1926, and then a craft guild for makers of handicrafts was organized in 1928. A farmers purchasing cooperative and a cooperative creamery soon followed. There was an attempt to create what were called study groups, as in the Antigonish movement, in the early 1940s. And then finally, in the late 1940s, a cooperative sweet potato curing house was built in Brasstown. The Brasstown community's strong interest in cooperatives and working together to build the folk school prompted Dr. Francis Sage Bradley, visiting in February 1927 to remark, quote, I have never seen a community so cooperative in spirit as Brasstown. You do not realize yet what has come among you. It is too new and unusual, but in 10 years, if you hold together, all the country will be looking to Brasstown. Initially, the folk school brought in several Danish staff familiar with co-ops to assist with starting its projects. Most famously, there's George Bidstrup, who married Marguerite Butler in 1936 and eventually became director. And he originally ran the folk school's farm and taught Danish gymnastics and dance. Sigurd Nielsen served as the first manager of the cooperative creamery, helping to get the business organized and started, and he was assisted by his wife, Kirsten. The second creamery manager to be hired was also Danish, but really only stayed for a couple months at the most. But then by the early 1930s, or by 1930, the manager was a local man, and the creamery was primarily staffed by local people for the rest of its history. And while the cooperatives were instigated by the folk school, they did have their own boards of directors that included both some folk school staff and then even more members of the local community. So to start with the credit union, at its outset it was housed in Fred O. Scrogg's store in downtown Brasstown. Statistics on the credit union indicate it had several dozen members in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And all of these were drawn from within a small radius of the town, like membership was restricted within a couple miles. By late 1927, so in its first year, the credit union had about $800 in capital and had made 13 loans, primarily for agricultural supplies, livestock, and home repairs. At least one loan had already been paid using the circular system that the co-ops ideally supported, which was that a cow purchased with the loan had already produced enough cream to pay off that loan. Surviving loan agreements provide additional samples of the loan amounts and what the money was used for. In the mid-1940s, for example, loans ranged from under $100 to $1,500. They were used for purchasing agricultural supplies, livestock, land, construction or repair of buildings, vehicles, paying other debts like medical debt, and some other expenses like coal or traveling. At its outset, the credit union included a junior chapter for children. It was run like the adult credit union, with the members electing their own chairperson and officers. It grew from 4 members to 27 members within its first year, becoming the largest junior credit union branch in North Carolina at the time, though I don't know how much competition there was for that. The organization encouraged children to learn how to save money, including income they received from sources like milk cows, which eventually the cream could be sent to the Mountain Valley Creamery, from other farm products, and from selling Indian relics to storekeeper and credit union leader Fred O. Scruggs. The credit union started out with little money and faced an uphill journey to financial sustainability. One commentator in 1930 mentioned that most of the co-op credit union attempts in North Carolina had failed. I think there had been about 30 at that time. And he was amazed that the Brasstown Credit Union had almost doubled its resources in its first 3.5 years, despite having a high interest rate. And other statistics I found for the credit union said that more than $25,000 total was loaned between 1926 and 1947. The credit union continued until the early 1950s, and according to Marguerite in an oral history interview, the organization declined because the GI Bill made it easy for veterans to get loans from traditional banks after World War II, so there wasn't as much need for this local credit union. The Brasstown Farmers Cooperative was organized in 1928, primarily as a consumers cooperative for purchasing agricultural supplies like feed and fertilizer. It had a store building in downtown Brasstown. By late 1928, it had also opened a grist mill built by exchanging cooperative shares for lumber and labor to build the mill. A community hatchery was also part of the co-op, and I'm interested if anyone knows where this was located. In 1929, the Folk School newsletter reports that the hatchery had outgrown its, quote, meager accommodations in the corner of the old log barn and been moved into a charming little half-timbered house where 2,900 chicks were hatched within 5 months. The Farmers Cooperative also branched out into sales of local farm products. For instance, there's reference in 1933 of the co-op selling 2,000 bushels of rye, 8,000 pounds of dried apples, and 200 bushels of peas. In 1935, the Farmers Cooperative was merged with the Mountain Valley Creamery Co-op to form the Mountain Valley Cooperative. A play written by the 1940 to 41 winter course students at the Folk School tells the origin story of the Mountain Valley Creamery, with some interesting attempts at Danish and local dialect and maybe poking some fun at local figures. Fred O. Scruggs, George Bidstrup, and other community members were looking for an alternative to having to pay to ship their cream to Franklin, North Carolina. Used creamery equipment came up for sale in South Carolina, and a group of supporters from Brasstown and Murphy came together to raise the funds to purchase this. In the process, they beat out a rival private enterprise project in Hayesville, so there's some drama around that. With the necessary equipment and pledges for labor and materials to construct the building, the Mountain Valley Creamery was incorporated as a cooperative organization with contributing farmers as the shareholders. They really wanted it to be controlled not by merchants, but by the farmers who were bringing their products there. So the creamery started collecting cream from farmers in the region, turning it into butter, and selling this product to various markets as far away as Atlanta, Georgia. The creamery also soon added eggs to its sales. After the merger was finalized in 1935, the Mountain Valley Cooperative may have also had some kind of community cannery or a similar processing plant, and then it also added dressed poultry to the products that it sold. In 1937, it began selling pasteurized fluid milk due to a new market with the TVA construction crews at Hiwassee Dam, and also soon moved into ice cream mix as well. Around 1940, the cooperative opened a gas station and grocery store in Brasstown, as well as an ice cream parlor in Murphy. And so according to the Cherokee County Historical Society, the ice cream parlor was in this building at 33 Peachtree Street, which is currently the Ferry Cross Bottle Shop. By 1949, county cooperatives in both Cherokee and Clay counties were dissolving to join the Mountain Valley Co-op, so it opened additional stores in Murphy and Hayesville. Probably they didn't last that long. The creamery building, completed in 1929 and located just outside downtown Brasstown, was built primarily by local labor. It was presumably designed by Leon Deschamps, the Belgian architect who designed most of the Folk School's early buildings, among other jobs while on staff here. While the head stoneworker received a wage, many of the other construction workers were paid via shares in the creamery and kind of along with the staff. So I have an incomplete list of the people who were known to have worked at the creamery over the years, and a lot of local names recognizable on there. The creamery quickly increased its capacity in its early years and drew its cream from a wide range of farmers. By 1934, its annual production of butter had quadrupled from under 25,000 pounds per year to over 100,000 pounds. Cream was collected from 500 farms ranging from the creamery's neighbors to locations 85 miles away. 2 years later, the number of shippers of cream and eggs, this number includes the egg producers as well, was up to 900. In the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s, Olive reported that the two agricultural co-ops, quote, having these last hard years, furnished the farmer in cream, egg, and barter service almost his only income. In some cases, the increase in cash income over about 15 or 20 years was pretty monumental. One writer in 1948 explained that while the average family earned $86 each year in the early 1930s, a farmer who contributed to the Mountain Valley Co-op can now receive $200 to $600 per month, in about 15 years difference. Between better income, improved standards of living, and community activities, the same writer reported that veterans returning to the Brasstown area after World War II were more likely to remain local instead of migrating to cities. In addition to providing a market for dairy and poultry products, the creamery hosted a popular annual event to commemorate its founding. Meeting minutes and folk school newsletters describe Creamery Day each fall as an outdoor community festival featuring speakers, a fiddle contest, demonstrations, food, and more. The event promoted cooperative work and organizations, and it was also a time for the community to just gather together to enjoy a fun event. Much of the organizing for Creamery Day was done by the Women's Club. The Mountain Valley Creamery had an even rougher financial start than the credit union. The creamery operated at a loss during its first years, and Nielsen's salary wasn't even paid in full until 2 years after he left. The co-op seems to have been constantly having to adapt to changing markets and opportunities, which often required purchasing new equipment or constructing additions to the building in order to process new products. The Brasstown co-ops did have various forms of support from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, the State Extension Office, and Tennessee Valley Associated Cooperatives, or TVAC, a branch of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Some of the support was simply like encouraging cooperation by providing information and knowledge about processes, agricultural information, or by serving on the board of directors. Other support was more financially based, so most notably TVAC provided a $20,000 loan to Mountain Valley around the time of the 1935 merger. But this support might have been a mixed bag. While the loan made it possible for the Mountain Valley Cooperative to acquire new and improved machinery for the creamery and to start some other food product projects, there's indications that TVAC also pushed the co-op into making upgrades and expansions that the organization couldn't afford. And while I haven't been able to find out exactly why the Brasstown Credit Union closed, or when, or on the when, there's more evidence about the sudden and surprising end of the Mountain Valley Cooperative. By the late 1940s, after continued expansion, the Mountain Valley Co-op appeared to be doing well. In 1949, it reportedly brought in over $400,000 with $186,500 paid off to its farmers. It seemed so successful that all of the Marguerite were concerned about what they referred to as a political situation with an unnamed faction that was trying to take control of the business. But apparently, the creamery's favorable financial reports were misleading, and it went bankrupt in 1952. A new manager's audit showed that, in fact, the creamery had lost more than $60,000 over some length of time, and then issues with production and with egg prices meant that it couldn't recover from that. The creamery was soon sold out to Campbell Dairy. Campbell was a large dairy cooperative that operated in the southern states. The George Bidstrup called it a cooperative in name only. The creamery building was then, after that, sold to Steel Test Dairy, and then closed, and it's now been renovated and turned into Highlander Gallery. Though not formal co-ops themselves, the men's and women's clubs in Brasstown intentionally served hand in hand with the cooperative aims of the folk school's founders. They provided gathering spaces in which topics related to the co-ops could be discussed, as well as opportunities for group recreation and other gatherings that lifted spirits and heightened participants' sense of community. In correspondence, Olive explained that the men's club primarily focused on agricultural matters and the women's club on handicrafts. She explained that each group had monthly meetings both separately and together, which provided both social opportunities and information presented by various speakers. In keeping with the Danish cooperative model, people were often members of one or more cooperatives and the men's or women's club and involved with folk school community activities. So there's a really high level of community and civic engagement going on. Club involvement and group recreation at meetings or at the folk school brought people together. The December 1933 folk school newsletter explained, quote, "We have learned that playing together is the first essential in working together. Our creamery has been able to live and grow through these last few difficult years because a small group, through play first, learned to know one another and to stand together." The Women's Club began in fall 1926 as a means by which community women, quote, "hope to better understand community problems and help toward their solution." This also provided mental and social stimulation to go alongside women's daily farm life, important for feeling fulfilled by rural living. One member noted in 1930, quote, "My work is as big as the kitchen, the chicken house, and the hog pen. Now I have things to think on as I go about my work." The Women's Club eventually went beyond the farm in a literal way too, sponsoring annual trips to see new sights and to relax. In 1937, the club even took a trip to the sea. A folk school newsletter from that year remarked, quote, "If you have not lived closely on a small farm all your life, you cannot know the refreshment, courage, and new life that comes through such trips." The Women's Club also did a lot of event organizing, such as the annual Old Folks Party, as well as the annual Creamery Day. The 1927 Folk School newsletter provides one example of the Women's Club's long list of annual activities. And I'm not going to read all of this, but there's Halloween parties, Christmas parties, an Easter egg hunt, the Old Folks Party, of course, and some also like public health and community relief work. And I find it really notable that many of the events that are credited to the Women's Club in these documents are now annual festivities that continue at the folk school in one form or another today. The Women's Club was active until around 1950. Marguerite explained in that oral history interview that the group was, quote, "an extremely active organization until we had home agents come into both counties, and then we didn't want to duplicate the work that the county was carrying on." One other thing that the Women's Club was responsible was starting the Craft Guild, or Handicraft Association, in 1928. There's not a ton of documentation about this in the archives, like how it was organized or anything like that, but one description of it does state that it was, quote, "not a true cooperative, but working toward the cooperative ideal." In its first year, crafts included hearth brooms and patchwork chair covers. By 1934, the Guild had 46 members who had been paid around $1,400 total over the past year for wood carving, woodworking, weaving, natural dyeing, and broom making. And there's some other crafts like basketry that are also mentioned in other references. In 1936, the numbers had increased to 65 craftspeople, earning over $3,400 total. Notably, the Brasstown carvers emerged as part of the Craft Guild. The folk school's first wood carving classes were likely taught by Margaret Campbell of Pleasant Hill Academy in Tennessee in 1930. The first mention of community carvings for sale is in the folk school's spring 1933 newsletter. Quote, "Carving is by no means only a student industry. Our steady carvers are largely from the community. The little mad and sober mules, geese, pigs, horses, and rabbits of polished applewood may be a luxury to the buyer, but they are a very real help to the makers, some of whom have literally carved out a large part of their living this winter." By the end of 1933, there were 36 people in the Guild who were carving, ranging in age from 11 years old to presumably elderly. They're called grandfathers. Wood carving soon became a popular craft, with carvers making the most money of Guild members by 1937. The impact of the Craft Guild was more than just financial. In the folk school model, making handcrafts is also about enjoying the creative process and working with one's hands to make a beautiful object. This is borne out by quotes from the Craft Guild members, such as, quote, "It means so much to get away from the work I have to do around the farm and place and make something as pretty as this." In 1932, Olive had written that, quote, "Until we have a larger output, the school furnishes teacher and does all the work of marketing. Later, however, we expect this association to stand on its own feet." This vision does not appear to have come to fruition. There's no evidence that the Craft Guild became self-supporting outside of the folk school, and teachers continue to be supplied by the school. Of the community crafts started in the early years of the folk school, only the Brasstown carvers continue as a really organized group today. And it's possible that the craft guild ended as other organizations took on its organizing and marketing goals. For instance, the Cherokee County Crafters were founded in 1947 through the Agriculture Extension Office as a producing center of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, so that might have just replaced the Brasstown one. By 1938, Olive Dame Campbell was also interested in starting study groups in the area, like those of the Antigonish movement in Nova Scotia. The folk school was visited by some people from this movement in 1938. George and Marguerite attended a meeting or conference in the same year. There's a couple Antigonish movement publications in the archives, including a copy of this title contributed by the Mountain Valley Cooperative Educational Committee in 1941. And I don't really have a great understanding of Antigonish at this point, but basically it seems to have had similar goals to the folk school for economic and social uplift. In the Antigonish movement, adult education and cooperatives went hand in hand, with community study groups as the primary mode of the education component. In 1939, the Keith Fund, which is the same fund that finished the Keith House, provided the funds for that, contributed additional money to the school, with a portion of that marked specifically for assisting the development of study groups. In 1940, Oliver marked that, quote, "Those of us who have been trying out the study circle method in the Southern Mountains are pretty much of the opinion that a thoroughly convinced and magnetic leader has to keep in constant touch with the group so they do not flatten out." Apparently, the folk school never found such a leader for the study groups, though that might have been impacted by World War II happening around the same time. There's some evidence of study groups continuing in 1941 over the winter, primarily made up of former folk school students. In 42 and 43, there was focus on masters of their own destiny, the book pictured here. But it's unclear how much Antigonish-style study groups continued after the early 1940s. George Bistrup proposed to use the model with students in 1949. It doesn't really say whether that actually happened. And during his time as a director, there's some more mentions in the early 1960s, but again, it's not clear if it's following this particular model or not. And then the last co-op is the Sweet Potato House. And I've heard that it's this building on Settleway Road in Brasstown. Can anyone confirm? It's been converted into a residence.
Isn't that owned by owners of the Crown now?
I don't know.
No, this is being converted into a residence now. It's being converted into a residence.
It's being converted into a residence now. Do you know what it was used for before that?
Say that?
Do you know what it was used for before that?
Storage. Some people have lived in there, but it was basically storage.
Okay, cool. So the Sweet Potato House was constructed in 1947. It provided space for community members to cure and store their sweet potatoes so that it lengthened the shelf life of this crop. Plans were also made, though I don't know if they were completed, for the co-op to construct a community canning plant. This seems to occur every couple decades. I don't know if any of these were built besides the one here later. There's not much else in the archival records about the Sweet Potato House other than George Bistrup in 1952 refers to it as a miscue that was not able to repay its credit union loan. The initial enthusiasm for co-ops and the cooperative spirit that was noted by Dr. Bradley carried through for a time. A folk school newsletter in 1931 joyfully reported, quote, "Already we at Brasstown, who have bound ourselves together in clubs or cooperatives, find our interest flowing over into other than purely economic fields. We are reading more, we are thinking more. We are beginning to be concerned over questions which touched us little before. Public health, law enforcement, juvenile delinquency, normal wholesome recreation, the beauty of our community. We are concerned, too, that surrounding communities should create for themselves the life we have begun to live, and which in its fullness we see shining far ahead for our children's children." But as the 1930s continued, documents record the struggles in maintaining this energy. Printed notes found in the Mountain Valley Creamery papers quite literally outlined the issues that the co-ops faced in 1934, and you can just see some examples up there. One of the aspects of the Danish system that was held up as an example was the high quality of Danish products because Danish farmers constantly worked to improve their livestock and production. However, encouraging a similar spirit among the farmers of Southwest North Carolina appears to have been a difficult task. There's repeated concerns in the Creamery's Board of Director meeting notes about the need to increase production from local dairy farmers, and the board thought this would be possible with increased herd size and better fed cows. In 1933, Olive spoke in the Creamery's annual meeting about the need for improved animal husbandry practices to promote profits. These included farmers growing more of their own feed, providing better quality feed to their cows, and keeping and then examining statistics on their herds to determine which cows produced well and which ones should be culled due to poor production. The quality issue was also related to the quantity of cows in the region, as the Creamery's truck routes were long and were on a weekly basis due to the distance needed to travel to collect enough milk. If raw materials could arrive in a higher quality state, and therefore create higher grade products and generate more money, that could happen if they were collected more frequently, but there just weren't enough cows in the area serviced by the Creamery to do that. Developing local leaders and commitment to cooperation is also a recurring issue in the archival documents. Olive wrote in 1937, quote, "The cooperative depends enormously, far too much, on the folk school's help at this time. One cannot build up a real understanding of cooperation in a short time. We are trying to develop local leadership and to gradually shift the responsibility from the school, but at present it seems difficult to do this." Various concerns voiced in board meeting minutes indicate that the co-op board members, especially Olive and Marguerite, found it difficult to maintain a strong cooperative spirit among local people despite that initial enthusiasm. In a talk to the Mountain Valley Cooperative Board in 1940, George Bidstrup, quote, stressed the point of the seemingly better cooperation in those early days and asked for more cooperation in the business of today. Tensions also arose between the folk school staff and local community members. Olive, Marguerite, and other folk school staff who were primarily outsiders to Appalachia continued to serve on the boards of the co-ops alongside people who primarily had grown up in and around Brasstown. In 1937, Olive wrote of the difficulty in getting the manager of the Mountain Valley Cooperative to distribute information about co-ops. She also said that Fred O. Scroggs, that early key supporter of the folk school and its efforts, quote, resents not only the school, but in true mountain fashion, state and government interference when it came to managing the co-ops. She explained that when the folk school staff, quote, try to do anything, we are blamed for managing. And when we are not able to put over certain things, we are blamed for the poor conduct of affairs. By 1941, even the publicly circulated folk school newsletter had some pessimistic notes about the cooperatives. Quote, no one can know the problems and difficulties of such an organization who has not followed it closely as it tries to adjust its service to the changing needs of a widely scattered agricultural population which still fails to understand thoroughly the values of cooperation. But even as Olive and others felt that maintaining or raising cooperative understanding was difficult, the co-ops had a very real financial impact on their members, as I've talked about a little bit already, and especially during the Great Depression. Local jobs became especially scarce or even non-existent at the beginning of the 1930s. The folk school and the co-ops provided some direct employment, while the creamery ensured a market for certain farm products, and the craft guild provided important supplemental income. Fred O. Scroggs referred to the Mountain Valley Creamery as, quote, the farmer's only salvation in this section in the early 1930s. And this impact may even be supported statistically. The folk school's April 1935 newsletter reported that 25% of Cherokee County families and 34% of Clay County families were on relief, but only 7% of the families within a 2.5-mile radius of Brasstown were on relief. The folk school and its varied programs, including the cooperatives, also did help keep at least some local families on the land. A member of the Women's Club and Craft Guild stated in 1932, quote, we were on the point of leaving this country when the school came because we saw no future for our children. Now we do, and what is more, we want them to stay in this section. Another folk school newsletter in 1936 reported, quote, the young people are reshaping their values. It is practically unknown for one of our students to express a desire to live and work in a great city. Those who go away to more advanced studies do so that they may return as even better farmers. Interest in staying on the land was financially supported by the co-ops and the folk school from time to time. The credit union helped provide loans for home and land purchases. In the late 1930s, the folk school also started a student fund to assist their former students who lived in the area with purchasing their own farms. And then finally, a machine club started in the early 1940s, provided modern agricultural equipment to be shared among farmers. The 1940s and 50s brought significant changes to the folk school. World War II had pulled away the young adults who might have otherwise attended the school during the war years, and special veterans craft training programs were established when the war ended. Olive retired as director of the folk school in 1946. Interestingly, the next directors also had links to cooperative and reform efforts. Olive was succeeded by Dagnall Folger, who had previously been farm security administrator of two New Deal cooperative subsistence homestead communities. He was at Cumberland Homesteads in Tennessee and in Tigard Valley in West Virginia. Activist Howard Kester was director for about a year, and then George Fitzgerald, obviously pretty involved with cooperatives, took the reins from 1952 until 1967. John Ramsey, who had lived in the Silo intentional community for several years, served as director from 1967 to 73. He and colleague Warren Kramer involved the folk school in various agricultural co-ops in the region, particularly due to the Tomato Trellis Project and the need to market the tomatoes grown at the folk school. However, from oral histories, they appear to have been unaware of, or at least were not inspired by, the school's earlier cooperative history, even though this is kind of in line with a lot of their ideals. After 1973, with the folk school in dire financial straits, the focus of the school's curriculum shifted towards the structure of week-long craft, music, and dance classes that we're all familiar with today. During the beginning years of the John C. Campbell Folk School, its co-founders explained that, quote, a school which would help the mountain country must do a double office, fire the imagination to what life may be, and at the same time try to meet in a practical fashion the economic and social problems of country life. Drawing from a Danish model, cooperatives were an essential part of the folk school's attempts to address those economic and social problems. The cooperative store, creamery, credit union, community clubs, study groups, and craft guild brought opportunities for meaningful socialization and served as sources of income, cash, and supplies, especially during the economically turbulent 1930s. At the same time, these cooperative efforts often struggled with financial and social sustainability. As the United States recovered from the Great Depression and World War II, the educational and economic needs of the region changed, and other sources emerged for the services that these co-ops had provided. The folk school evolved along with these changes. The cooperatives were closed, sometimes with surprising quickness, and the folk school eventually found success by focusing its energies on a smaller selection of aspects of that original Danish model on which it was founded. The legacy of the folk school's early co-ops lives on in many ways, such as the Brasstown carvers, the annual events that have continued now for 100 years, and the families who may have chosen to remain in Brasstown during difficult years because of the supports offered by the early folk school and its co-ops. Thanks. Yeah.
What was the biggest population of Brasstown? Were there more buildings than what are there right now?
Does anybody know the answer to a question about the largest population size that Brasstown has hit?
You didn't find anything about where the source of the name or anything like that?
I've always heard of like a couple hundred people for the population of Brasstown. For the name, it's a mistranslation of a Cherokee word that has to do with green valleys, I believe, but it got translated as brass.
What I always heard was when a girl had a baby, a boy left town, and that the town size stayed the same.
I heard that one.
I was wondering if the cooperative concept ever ran into trouble during the time of the Red Scare in this country and the seeking out of communists, and was that ever, did that become a problem around here?
So I haven't seen any evidence of that, and it might be that they're going out in the early 1950s, which would be, I think, about the time that the Red Scare is starting to pick up. But also, like, there's not really talk among the papers or probably in the community about like this being like a communal thing or like something related to like communism or something. And like other people who are writing about Danish cooperatives actually promote this as like an ideal democratic form because you have the working class who has control of things, but it's not in the sense of like, it's not in the same sense as a communist argument or socialist argument. So it's interesting that they're not tying it into that form of ideology. It's tied to democracy.
I've been fascinated with the premise of progress directly correlated to the roads that are built. So in the context of, I guess, the late 20s and the 30s, whatever there, for the co-ops, and the fact that they're having trouble with the long drives, they get the milk and all those things like that. Were all the roads still basically dirt roads or gravel roads, or when did the first ever, what we would call, stone paved roads or thing of that nature come through the community? Is that evident?
I haven't run across much mention of the roads. Some of the people who are more familiar with the local history know more about when roads were paved.
Well, I'm sure I'm the only civil engineer in the room, so when the Great Depression struck, there had been some paving of major roads by then. But a lot of the work you see on the rural roads was done by the CCC. I had 5 uncles that left home, worked in the CCC camps until World War II started. So between 1932 and 1941, they were working in CCC camps, building the Blue Ridge Parkway, building parks, paving, working on dams. So there was a lot of civil engineering work that occurred in the 30s. And of course, after World War II, then with the advent of so much heavy equipment and people used to working with heavy equipment, that's when the road building really got started. But I mean, you think about it, these mountain roads around here, they would have to be paved if they were going to be serviceable, because they just wash away all the time, right?
And I also don't know locally, like, if the TVA got involved with roads either for like having to transport equipment and materials for all the building that they were doing.
I would think so. It seems like a logical conclusion, right?
See what
Even to, they would build houses for their staff, or in places that at least were accessible, but there weren't a lot of those places in close proximity to where they were building the dams.
The Appalachian Regional Commission was the big force behind the building in the whole region, and they never did finish a bunch of them, like Corridor K, fortunately, which would have cut through the snowbird mountains. But, they had all these connections they wanted to make, Chattanooga to Asheville and across North Georgia. A lot of those happened. And this was US 64 until 1964 or 5, I think, when they built the new 64. So that wasn't that long ago to people my age.
The Appalachian Regional Commission wasn't developed till the 60s, right?
60s, yeah.
So maybe the follow-on question is, what role did rural electrification have with the co-ops, things of that nature? I always speak in the context, my dad particularly, they grew up in far eastern North Carolina, and we did not have electricity until he was born in the 30s, so they didn't have electricity until he was a young teenager kind of thing, and still had oil lamps and all kinds of other things there. So I just wondered in the context of the co-ops, whatever there, I say this with humor, when did the 20th century emerge? In the, electric roads, electric telephone, all those sort of things. How might they have influenced the cooperative premise, particularly in Brasstown and around here?
Yeah, I also don't know an answer to that question. I know Fred Scroggs was involved with some of the electric cooperatives, but I think that was a little bit later on, and I'm not really sure exactly when electricity became like normal in Brasstown. Right with the TVA.
46 and 47.
Okay, 46 and 47.
After the
Yeah.
war, so.
After the war.
Yeah, but the rural electrification act is a big program under FDR.
That's why I was asking
That's
in
started.
the context there, so I compliment you. You have many hints about the impact that the Great Depression had. I mean, it had an profound effect across the entire nation, but it sounds like they survived better than many other areas did, because of the cooperation, and they were able to get through extraordinarily difficult years. Is that your impression from the reading and things?
Yeah, like the newsletters and some other sources definitely mention that, like, well, we're still poor, but we're better off than a lot of other people because we have these supports in place that help provide more income right now. And I think also because the cooperatives continued through the Depression, like there's some other references to like all of the other local businesses going out of business during that time frame. I don't know if that's entirely accurate or not. But there's like just literally like no other jobs until the TVA comes in, versus there's a source of income with the co-ops.
Did the creamery with those large structures, the barn structure that's not there anymore, did they actually house a dairy herd? Did they have their own cows?
I don't think so. I haven't run into any references to them having their own cows, and the folk school was the largest contributor of like milk or cream and eggs. So I think because there's the folk school and then enough other contributors, they didn't have to have their own. And they were busy with making the products.
Did you find reference to part of the problem being that the government changed the milk standards as to refrigeration and processing and things like that undermined the local farmers' ability to put out their cans of milk for purchase by the creamery? Any reference to that as being an issue?
I haven't run into anything specifically about that, though I think there was a mention of like the folk school dairy having to pivot really fast to be able to create grade A pasteurized milk. But it's not, I think the records don't go in enough detail to catch that. Do you know when that change was?
Pardon?
Do you know when that change was?
No. I just heard it as part of a place donor conversation some years ago.
Yeah, and there's also some references to like having financial support for farmers to do some modernization. I don't know if it's related specifically to that change, or just in general requirements for going from cream that's going to be better to the fluid milk, pasteurized fluid milk.
I guess it's post-war sort of thing, but
I had a question about when electricity actually came to the folk school, because every time I look up here at the rafters, and some of these rafters must be 25, 30 feet long, and without having something like electricity here on campus, how are they able to build this place like it is? Because from my information, the Keith House itself was built in 1927 with local labor, so they must have had a sawmill powered by something in order just to create these rafters for the community, health, or whoever to build this. So, do you have any actual dates of when electricity came to Brasstown?
Not offhand. I mean, there's Mill House. I mean, that was built after Keith House, but that provided, I think, the original electricity for the folk school. It was the water wheel at Mill House, right?
Yeah.
Just for the milking barn, really.
Okay,
But
just
it
the
also
milking
powered,
barn.
mechanically it powered woodworking machinery, because the woodworking shop was in there. But I gotta believe they just brought in this plain lumber from somewhere. They must have bought the plain lumber from somewhere, mills in Tennessee or whatever. But Mr. Davidson said he remembered watching them saw these beams by hand with a pit saw, with a big crosscut saw.
They used to use portable steam engines to run sawmills.
Mm-hmm.
My family owned some land up in Virginia that every time we drove in, there was a big old blown up steam engine on the side of the dirt road that had blown up in 1920. One day somebody didn't put enough water in it. And it had a flywheel that was 6 foot in diameter, weighed about 1,000 pounds. And that was all brought in by mule train. And they, timbered 2,000 or 3,000 acres before it blew up. So there used to be a lot of portable steam engines. That was a big business.
Well, I remember hearing also that Oscar Cantrell had ordered the sawmill, and the statement I heard was that he was left-handed, so it was designed to be operated by a left-handed person. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do remember being here. I came here in 1974, and the folk school was in pretty dire straits. And at that time, in fact, I lived off of Mule Road, which is now Scruggs Road, but they would close for the winter, at that time. And Martin Kelly was the closing artist who had to crawl through an open window to open the folk school for Gus and Maggie Masters. And that was a long time ago, early 70s.
Ellie Wilson's tenure was 40 to 41, is that right?
Yeah, like she came here just before the start of just before Pearl Harbor.
Right. So I feel like in her book she does reference that there is one telephone on campus, and that there was somebody who had to live closest to that phone because they were getting married maybe, or there was some family thing, but I think it was in Keith House. I think that one telephone was in Keith House. So if there was a phone in just one in 1940, there certainly were, there had to be more broader electricity than, say, Millhouse at that time too. I don't recall that she's talking about lighting lamps or any, particular difficulty. I think she even talks about using flashlights to, get around campus. So I think by 40 there's lights. I just don't know what they are like. And my guess is it would have been an electrical co-op at that point.
Mr. Myers was my neighbor. He had a dairy farm, cows. He didn't get electricity until 1952, he said.
Is there an effort either nowadays or in the recent past where not only members of the folk school community but neighbors in the surrounding area can contribute oral histories? Because just listening to folks talk here, there's a lot of information that could be generated from, people who have been here a long time or have returned to take classes or to participate on the board or whatever, and journals from their families and just the stories that people have heard. I mean, I met someone at lunch whose last name is Penland, and I didn't even know that was a name that was circulating in this community years ago. So it just seems like there's a lot of rich history that could be, used to flesh out more than Olive and Marguerite's journals and stuff.
Yeah, that's such a great idea that we're doing that for the 100th.
Great, good to hear.
I just wanted to add a more modern story. I'm thinking back, my mother said she was a baby when the creamery was dedicated. And David Lyden used to work here, and he brought home these films because there was no archival storage system at that time. And he just found these films and he brings them home. And I had just had Emlyn just turned 41. So my mother was there, and she says, "Do you see a kid eating dirt?" And that was her strong memory, was that so her father was Mayor Murphy when they dedicated the creamery, but what she was watching was the little kid eating dirt. And we said, no, I didn't see that. So the second story is a few years ago, and I never know when anything happened, just that it happened. This woman came to Morning Song, and after Morning Song, she came up to me and she said, do you know about the tomato project? And I'm one of the few people that had heard of the tomato project. And so it was one of John Ramsey's, so she showed a picture of John Ramsey being a famous dancer, and he was trying to continue the agricultural legacy of the school, and they were growing tomatoes. I remember when I was a kid, there was a tomato packing house in downtown Murphy. And so I didn't ever even think about all these different parts, right? And I said, so you grew tomatoes? And she said, oh no, I was from Florida. I came as a volunteer to pick the tomatoes as a college student. And she said the problem was they weren't ripe. So I stayed for my allotted time. It was, it couldn't have been spring break. That's too early, so I don't know which break it was. And then I went back. And so that was one of the complaints about the tomato project, was when you had the help to pick them, they weren't ready. And as soon as the help went back to college, they were ready. So I said, do you have any strong memories of the school? So I tried to get her to help me understand where the tomato fields were, which I think were the fields below Rock House, but I'm not sure. I have further stories and all that, but I won't keep on going. But she said there was a woman in the dining hall who wove these beautiful tapestries. So that's Alice Tipton, and I knew Alice Tipton. And then she said, and the carving. I loved the carving. So those were her strong memories of being here. Tomatoes weren't ripe. She loved carving and weaving.
One final question? Yeah.
So I'm still confused as how we went from agriculture to craft. Because was Olive Dane Campbell gone by then, or was she helping to make the transition? And who kind of made the transition and came up with the idea, like, let's make it where people come and take classes? That's a pretty big transition.
Yeah, I mean, there have been classes of one sort or the other since practically the beginning. That's
Right.
the point. In like 1930s, when the short courses start, which is like a 2-week summer, or sets of 2-week summer classes, and that has more like outsider people coming in. Like it's not just for like local students, right?
Doing craft.
Some is a really recreation focused, so a lot of dancing.
That's what I thought.
And then also, yeah, craft too. So, and there's craft incorporated into the longer, like 4-month residential program that happened over the winter. So there's craft going on from the beginning, yes, from the late 1920s and the 30s. And then, like agriculture, they keep trying to make it continue. Like there's letters from the 1950s where they're like, is it worthwhile to continue the farm? And some people say yes, and some people say no. And John Ramsey came in as kind of the last director with the agricultural experience and focus on that side. And he comes in right after George, who of course is agriculture focused. And John builds the festival barn, which almost bankrupts the school. And the board's not very happy with the things that he's doing, including building the festival barn. And so the main kind of change point is John Ramsey is fired in 1973. They sell off the cows, they start leasing out festival barn in the field. So that's really the end of like the agricultural focus. And then as like new, especially like the masters coming in as the next permanent directors, there's an interim in between, but they come in as the next permanent directors. And so it's really with them that there's like the real craft focus and not any attempt at like a longer term program for the most part, besides like homesteading.
73.
Yeah, 73 is really kind of the big turning point.
So the festival barn wasn't really the festival barn, it was a milking barn.
Yeah, it was a dairy barn.
Okay, it was a dairy barn.
Yeah.
And that almost bankrupted the school.
And it almost bankrupted the school. Yeah.
Agriculture. We try so hard.
Yeah.
They were working hard. Darn it.
Says one of the owners of Fool's Paradise.
All right, thanks y'all for coming out tonight.